Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode in the Globe webinar series on the future of global governance. I am Carrie Otterburn of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Today, we are joined by Professor Kristen Hopewell to discuss her book, Clash of Powers, U.S.-China Rivalry in Global Trade Governance, published in 2020 by Cambridge University Press. Professor Kristen Hopewell is Canada Research Chair in Global Policy in the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia. Her research specializes in international trade, global governance, industrial policy, and development, with a focus on emerging powers. She is also a Wilson China Fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Also joining us today as discussant is Dr. Jappe Eckhardt. Jappe is Senior Lecturer in International Political Economy at the Department of Politics of the University of York. Jappe's research interests fall in the fields of international political economy, global governance, and economic regionalism, and focus in particular on the politics of trade, business-government relations, global value chains, and emerging economies in the global trading system. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation by Kristen of about 25 minutes. Then Jappe will start off the discussion by offering some reflections and asking a few questions, and the author will have an opportunity to respond. Then we'll turn to questions from you, the audience. Feel free to send questions to me throughout the webinar by using the webinar chat box function at the bottom of the webinar window. I will collect your questions to share with the speaker following the presentation. Before we begin, just a few quick words about the GLOBE project. Funded by the European Commission's Horizon 2020 program, GLOBE seeks to understand the constraints and opportunities for the European Union in promoting its interests and values through global governance, with specific attention to 4 key areas: trade and development, security and migration, climate change, and global finance. The 3.5-year project aims to identify the major roadblocks to effective and coherent global governance by multiple stakeholders in a multipolar world, as well as look ahead to 2030 and 2050 in order to equip policymakers with the tools they will need to deal with future challenges. On behalf of the GLOBE project, I would like to thank Kristen and Jappe for joining us today. And now it is my great pleasure to hand the floor over to Kristen.
Great, thank you for that introduction. And I want to thank Carrie and Jappe and the organizers for the opportunity to be here today and to share some of the research from my new book, Clash of Powers, U.S.-China Rivalry in Global Trade Governance. I also want to thank the funders of the project, the UK Economic and Social Research Council and the Global Challenges Research Fund. So as we know, trade has become a flashpoint of conflict between the US and China. We've seen a dramatic escalation in trade tensions between the world's 2 largest economies. Attention has overwhelmingly focused on their bilateral trading relationship. Things like the size of the US trade deficit with China, allegations that China is engaged in unfair trading practices, and since President Trump, the US slapping tariffs on Chinese imports and igniting a trade war. In this book, I focus on a critical aspect of their growing rivalry that's been largely overlooked: their battle over the global institutions and rules governing trade. For over 70 years, the US has been the dominant state in the global economy and its governance. As John Eikenberry puts it, from its position as global hegemon, the world's dominant power, the US effectively ran the system. It constructed the institutions of global economic governance, institutions like the WTO, the IMF, and the World Bank. And these institutions served as an important channel for the projection of American power, and their rules have also reflected its primacy. But now, after 4 decades of rapid and sustained economic growth, China has emerged as the world's leading trading state and 2nd largest economy. So this has given rise to 2 major debates. First, are we in the midst of a hegemonic transition from the US to China, or does the US maintain its dominance? And second, how will the rise of China affect the system of global economic governance constructed under American hegemony? So the book intervenes in each of these debates by analyzing China's impact on global trade governance, which is really at the heart of the US-led liberal international economic order. It focuses on 2 key multilateral institutions for governing trade: the WTO, which is the core institution created to govern the trading system, and the OECD arrangement on export credit, which also plays a critical role in maintaining the liberal trading order. Now, many have dismissed claims about the rise of China and a decline in US hegemony as exaggerated or overblown. They point out that by virtually every conventional measure of power, whether economic, military, or soft power, the US still has a huge lead, as Daniel Drezner puts it, and remains vastly more powerful than China. So even just in economic terms, for example, the Chinese economy is still only about 2/3 the size of that of the US. This leads many to conclude that China is not an imminent threat to American dominance and that the US remains secure in its position as the world's sole superpower. Comparisons are frequently drawn to earlier erroneous predictions in the 1980s and 90s that a rising Japan would surpass the US and bring an end to its dominance, with the argument being that China's purported threat to American hegemony will prove similarly fleeting and illusory. Now, with regard to the second debate concerning China's impact on global economic governance, many assume that since China has benefited from an open and rules-based trading system, which has enabled its remarkable economic growth and development, that it's therefore heavily invested in maintaining that system. The general consensus, even among scholars coming from very different theoretical perspectives in international relations, is that China is not seeking to overthrow the existing global economic order, but instead is fundamentally supportive of its overarching goals and principles and seeking to sustain it. Much is seen to rest on the willingness of the US to incorporate China into existing global governance institutions and to give it appropriate weight and authority in decision-making. If so, it's argued that China will readily integrate into and support those institutions and that they'll continue to function smoothly and effectively. So in sum, the prevailing view is that the US maintains its dominance in the international system. China does not possess sufficient power to pose a real threat to American hegemony. And even if it did, China would likely support rather than challenge the existing system of global economic governance that the US has created. The book, however, challenges each of these assumptions. I argue that China's rise has in fact proven far more destabilizing, both for US power and for global economic governance, than previously recognized. I show that China has proven a significant counterbalance to American power that sharply constrained the US's institutional power, meaning its power over the institutions and rules that govern the global economy. Existing trade institutions created under US hegemony are being undermined, and American efforts to construct new trade rules have been repeatedly thwarted by a rising China. Despite the US's superior power resources, its greater levels of economic, military, and soft power, China has been able to persistently block the US from achieving its objectives across a wide range of different areas of trade governance. So amid the rise of China, I argue, the US's ability to dominate the governing institutions of the trading system and to write the rules of trade has been substantially weakened. So in contrast to the assumption that a rising China can be smoothly integrated into the system of global economic governance created under US hegemony, I show that China's rise has created serious challenges for the multilateral trade regime. The US and China have been engaged in a struggle over the rules of the game, and specifically whether and how the rules will apply to China. I demonstrate that this conflict between the two dominant powers has profoundly undermined the established system of global trade governance by eroding the efficacy of existing institutions and blocking global trade rulemaking. As a result, institutions that are essential to ensuring stability and order in the international trading system have been severely weakened. And importantly, what the book shows is that this was happening long before Trump and his assault on the multilateral trading system. So I construct this argument drawing on field research conducted over an 11-year period at the WTO in Geneva and the OECD in Paris, as well as in several national capitals. And I draw on 3 sources of data: over 200 interviews with trade negotiators, senior government officials, and stakeholders, extensive documentary analysis, and direct observation. So the book examines a number of different areas of global trade governance, including the Doha round, a comprehensive trade round, as well as negotiations following the collapse of the Doha round on agriculture subsidies and fishery subsidies, negotiations on export credit, which deals specifically with industrial goods and services, as well as negotiations on export credit for coal-fired power plants. Part of the goal of the book is to go beyond a narrow focus on US-China relations to examine the broader implications of the power struggle between the US and China. In other words, to show why US-China rivalry matters, not just for great power politics or the interests of these two particular states, but because it has critical implications for vital areas of global governance and policy. So what several of these cases in the book underscore is that the breakdown of global rulemaking and trade has significant consequences, not only for the governance of global markets and trade, but also for efforts to try to use trade rules to address pressing global problems related to both global development and the environment. And one of the things it also shows is that in certain areas, such as agriculture subsidies and fisheries subsidies, China's trade policies are having increasingly harmful effects, particularly for other developing countries. So I'd be happy to talk more about those issues related to development and environment and the effects of China's policies on the developing world. But for now, I'm going to focus on one specific case in the book that looks at the impact of a rising China on the export credit regime. So export credit is the use of loans and other forms of financing by states to promote their exports. And if provided at below market rates, state-backed export credit can act as a form of export subsidy, and thus have significant consequences for international trade patterns. The existing system of governance for export credit was created under the auspices of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, in the 1970s. It limits the ability of states to use export credit to subsidize and thus artificially boost their exports. For decades, this has been held up as an example of a highly successful global governance regime, with its system of disciplines proving highly effective in restricting the use of export credit as a form of state subsidy. However, I demonstrate that the rise of China has profoundly altered the landscape of export credit and disrupted its governance arrangements. Over the past 2 decades, there's been a dramatic expansion in the use of export credit by China. China has emerged as the world's largest supplier of export credit, providing volumes of financing 4 times greater than any other state. State-backed export credit is a key tool of China's development strategy, used to foster industrial upgrading and the international expansion of its domestic firms and industries. As I show, the US and other established powers have attempted to either incorporate China into the established global governance regime for export credit, or to engage it in the construction of a new regime. But China has refused to accept any international disciplines on its use of export credit. As a result, I argue, this explosion in the use of export credit by China is eroding the efficacy of existing international rules intended to prevent an export credit subsidy war. I contend that the disruption of the export credit regime highlights the conflict between the liberal principles of the existing global governance architecture and the economic development objectives of China and other emerging powers. So to very briefly provide a bit of background on export credit, basically every major economy in the world has an export credit agency, an ECA, that provides various forms of financing to facilitate and expand exports. This can include things like direct loans to foreign buyers, insurance and loan guarantees, and finance for large-scale infrastructure and industrial projects. States provide approximately $300 billion in trade-related finance annually. Export credit can be used either to address market failure, with export credit agencies stepping in to fill gaps in the availability of private financing, but export credit is also used as an important industrial policy tool and tool of export promotion. State-backed export credit tends to be concentrated in capital equipment and services sectors, so-called big-ticket exports, things like aircraft, satellites, industrial plants, infrastructure, transportation, construction, oil and gas, mining, and energy projects. State-backed export credit is particularly important in facilitating sales to emerging markets, where less developed banking and capital markets often limit the availability of private financing. The principal governance issue related to export credit arises from the fact that it may be subsidized by states as a means to make their exports more competitive, which could lead to a destructive competitive spiral of state subsidization via export credit. So export credit is governed by the OECD Arrangement on Export Credit. The arrangement's disciplines place strict limits on the financing packages that states are allowed to offer to borrowers, defining the most favorable terms under which credit may be granted. And over the past 40 years since its creation, the arrangement has been continuously revised and updated to tighten its disciplines. Importantly, this governance regime was very much a creation of American hegemony. The US was the key driver behind the initial creation of the arrangement, as well as the continual strengthening of its disciplines over the ensuing decades, sometimes using strong-arm tactics to compel other countries to cooperate. So the goal was to bring the global provision of export credit closer to market principles, so that states weren't using subsidized financing to distort trade. And that is in fact exactly what's happened. The arrangement has proven remarkably effective. It has very high rates of compliance, and it succeeded in virtually eliminating the subsidy component of export credit amongst its participants. In recent years, however, the global landscape of export credit has changed dramatically due to an explosion in export credit provision by China, as well as other emerging economies. Since 2000, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, have increased their official export financing from less than 3% to 40% of the world total. The vast majority of this increase has come from China, who constitutes 90% of the export credit activity of the BRICS and is now the world's largest export credit provider. So as you can see on the slide, China has 3 export credit agencies, the China Export-Import Bank, Sinosure, and the China Development Bank. And through these 3 institutions, in 2014, for example, China supplied $58 billion in export credit support, far more than the $12 billion provided by the US, and indeed more than all of the G7 rich countries combined. And on top of that, it also provided an additional $43 billion in overseas investment financing to promote its exports. So as you can see here, basically in the realm of export credit, China just dwarfs everyone else. It's providing vastly greater volumes of export credit financing than any other state. So export credit is a key part of China's development strategy. It's one of the prime means by which China is deploying its newfound financial power, including its massive foreign exchange reserves, to give its firms a competitive advantage in global markets, while also fostering industrial upgrading and the development of key strategic sectors. So what China does first is develop an infant industry domestically, and then it uses export credit to enable firms in that industry to expand globally. First by moving into emerging markets in Africa, Latin America, and developing parts of Asia, and then into more advanced economies. This has been critical in enabling China to move up the value chain, from low-wage, low-value manufacturing into more technology-intensive and higher value-added industries, where it's increasingly competing directly with advanced industrialized countries like the US, EU, and Canada. Export credit plays an important role in China's Made in China 2025 industrial strategy, where China is seeking to foster the development of more sophisticated, advanced manufacturing in order to enable its manufacturing sector to catch up with and eventually surpass the advanced industrialized countries to become the world's leading manufacturing power. So export credit is an essential part of China's effort to try to escape the middle income trap and develop into an advanced high income country. Export credit has been the driving force behind the expansion of China's activities in Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere. While often mistakenly described as aid, most of China's much publicized lending to Africa and other parts of the developing world is in fact in the form of export credit, loans that are tied to the export of Chinese goods. And similarly, much of the financing for China's Belt and Road Initiative, where China is providing, it's building power plants and ports, high-speed rail lines, and other forms of infrastructure across large parts of the world, much of the financing for the BRI is also in the form of export credit. So China has been characterized as conducting the most aggressive export credit financing campaign in history. And this strategy is proving extraordinarily effective. To quote one trade official, in almost every capital goods sector, China is going from being a bit player to being one of the biggest. China's use of export credit is therefore seen as a serious competitive challenge to advanced industrialized states like the US and those in Europe, and a significant threat to the export credit regime. China is not a member of the OECD nor bound by the rules of the arrangement. Given the scale of its export credit support, its non-participation threatens to undermine the established system of global governance for export credit. China uses its ability to extend export credit on more favorable terms in order to gain an advantage over participants in the OECD arrangement. So to quote one official, what China is doing is riskier transactions with fewer rules, slightly less cost, longer terms, and a lot more flexibilities. When you combine all of these things, it can be quite an attractive package. And since financing can account for as much as 40% of the cost of a project, attractive export credit terms give China's exports a significant competitive edge. Rail equipment provides an illustration of how China's ability to provide more favorable credit terms has advantaged its firms and helped to drive its process of industrial upgrading. So this is a big market valued at about $120 billion a year. And it's one of the priority industries that the Chinese government has targeted for overseas expansion as part of its efforts to transform China into an advanced manufacturing powerhouse. China uses cheap export credit to give its exports a significant cost advantage over its OECD competitors. And this has proven extremely effective. It's helped to fuel the dramatic growth in China's rail exports, as well as the global expansion of its firms. So as you can see here, China's CRRC, a state-owned company, is now the dominant firm in the global rail equipment industry, and it dwarfs its competitors, including Germany's Siemens, France's Alstom, Canada's Bombardier, and the US's GE. And the rise of CRRC, backed by this cheap, heavily state-subsidized export credit, has dramatically transformed the dynamics in this industry and have had really damaging effects for its competitors, which have really struggled to compete against CRRC and its cheap financing. So Siemens and Alstom, for example, attempted to merge an effort to better compete with CRRC, but that merger was actually blocked by the EU competition authorities. And both Bombardier and GE have been forced to sell off their rail businesses. So the rise of CRRC has dramatically transformed the dynamics in this industry, and state-backed financing has played a major role in that. So rail is just one example among the many industries where China is using more favorable export credit terms in order to give its firms a competitive edge in global markets. Another example is the ICT, the information and communications technology sector, where we see similar dynamics. This is also another priority industry targeted under the Made in China 2025 industrial strategy. China has aggressively supported the international expansion of firms like Huawei and ZTE by providing below-market financing to foreign buyers. This financial support from the Chinese government helped Huawei, for example, to become the world's largest telecom equipment manufacturer. So it's in this way that China uses cheap export credit to support the development of its national champions and to fuel their global expansion. So OECD exporters are strongly complaining that they're losing contracts to Chinese firms because of the more favorable financing packages that China is able to offer. In the words of the US Export-Import Bank chair, they're winning deals in part because they're not playing by the rules of the OECD arrangement. As another bluntly put it, everyone feels under attack. Given the massive volume of financing that it's providing, incorporating China into global rulemaking and disciplines on export credit became a key priority of the US, the EU, and other advanced industrialized states. As the head of the US Ex-Im Bank put it, it's important that they play by the rules that everyone else is playing by. So the US strongly pushed China to join the OECD arrangement, but its efforts were unsuccessful. Beijing has indicated that it will not join a set of rules that it played no role in creating and that don't reflect its own development objectives. China argues that the OECD arrangement, quote, aims to solve the problem of international competition among developed countries and does not reflect the development concerns of developing countries like China. So as a result, China has refused to join the OECD arrangement or to subject itself to its disciplines. There are thus fears among the OECD countries that the arrangement risks becoming obsolete. As one negotiator put it, the arrangement becomes pretty irrelevant pretty quickly if the world's biggest exporter won't participate. And China, of course, is the world's biggest exporter, but also the world's biggest provider of export credit. So thwarted in its efforts to try to convince China to join the arrangement, the US tried a different tack. In 2012, the US drove the creation of the new International Working Group on Export Credit, involving 18 major developed and developing countries, including China, in an effort to try to negotiate a successor to the OECD arrangement that would encompass the emerging economies. This was a US-led initiative pushed at the highest levels of government that came out of the bilateral US-China strategic and economic dialogue and meetings between then President Obama and President Xi Jinping. From the perspective of the US and other developed countries, the IWG was very much a second-best solution. As one US negotiator put it, we had dreamed of dragging China into the OECD arrangement, but the failure of that effort is what led to the IWG. So seeking to rein in export credit provision by China, the IWG represented an attempt by the US to maintain a liberal regime of export credit governance by replacing the arrangement with a new version that would incorporate the major emerging economies. The US identified this as a key strategic priority in its economic relations with China, and negotiators report that it pushed China very hard to enter into and engage in the negotiations. As one US official stated, everyone's hopes are resting on the IWG, that it will be able to control China's ability to take everyone's lunch. Other OECD countries backed the US quite strongly and placed similar emphasis on the IWG as a means to create new, more universal rules on export credit. However, although China formally agreed to participate in the IWG, it consistently thwarted the negotiations. China refused to take even the first preliminary steps that would be necessary for trade negotiations to begin in earnest, including, for example, refusing to provide even basic information about its export credit programs. As a result, as one negotiator stated, the process has been going on for years and there's been zero progress. So states were essentially meeting multiple times a year for negotiations, but China was foot dragging, throwing up all kinds of process-based hurdles, and basically doing everything that it could to impede the negotiations from moving forward. And of course, the negotiations couldn't move forward without China. So after many years of fruitless negotiations, the IWG was officially abandoned at the end of last year. The simple fact is that China has little incentive to accept disciplines that would limit its use of export credit and thus potentially inhibit its future growth and development prospects. And it's a sign of China's power that it's been able to successfully resist being pressured into a set of rules that it sees as fundamentally against its interests. So to wrap up, as the case of export credit, as well as the other cases analyzed in the book show, global trade governance has been profoundly destabilized by the rise of China. Contemporary power shifts are making multilateral cooperation to govern trade increasingly difficult. From its hegemonic position in the international system, the US was the driving force behind the creation of the liberal trading order and the continual strengthening of its disciplines. However, its current inability to press China into existing or new governance arrangements suggests that the capacity of the US to steer global rulemaking is diminishing amid the rise of China. In the case of export credit, as we saw, China's emergence as a major provider of government-backed trade finance has proven highly destabilizing to the transparent, rule-bound, orderly system for the governance of export credit. Reluctant to relinquish an important industrial policy tool that's vital to its continued economic development, China has valid reasons to resist external disciplines on its use of export credit. Nonetheless, however, its unwillingness to either join existing governance arrangements or subject itself to new disciplines threatens what has until now been a highly effective regulatory regime and risks prompting a reemergence of destructive competition via export credit subsidies. So this case thus throws into stark relief the tensions between the development objectives of China and other emerging powers and the American-led liberal international economic order. It also raises potentially significant implications for US strategy with regards to both China and trade going forward, which is something I'd be happy to discuss in our Q&A session. But for now, I'll wrap up there and look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristen, for this extremely interesting overview of some of the key findings, especially with regard to the export credit governance. This is all very much very interesting case study, and I'm curious to hear about some of the other cases perhaps in the Q&A. Now I would like to give the floor to Jappe to kick off today's discussion. But before we do, I'd like to quickly remind the audience that the Q&A will begin fairly soon. So if you would like to send any questions, please do so using the chat box feature at the bottom of the webinar window. And over to you, Jappe.
Yeah, thank you, Carrie. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me, and thanks for writing such a wonderful book. I want to congratulate her on the publication of that book. Yeah, I could easily spend my 10 minutes praising Kristen for her book, because I really think it is that good. I really enjoyed reading it. It's one of these rare academic books that appeal to a much wider audience than just scholars. It's written in a very accessible way and asks what Ben Cohen once called the really big questions in international political economy. All too often, academics focus on a very narrow or niche kind of topic, but Kristen clearly doesn't, as she aims to answer arguably one of the biggest questions of our time, and that is how the growing rivalry between the US and China is affecting the governance of global trade. And she answers this question in a very nuanced way by going beyond the kind of the issue and discussion whether or not the US is still the hegemon or not. She argues that regardless of this question on hegemonic transition, the US's ability to dominate the governing institutions of the trading system and to write the rules has been undermined severely by China's rise. And she shows that very convincingly in her cases in the book, and one of which she presented today. So yeah, as I said, I could go on in my praise, but of course I've been also asked to provide some critical reflections on and points of discussion. So that's what I will do in the remaining of my intervention. So my first question has to do with China's global leadership ambitions. So the book is about the struggle between the US and China over institutional power and who gets to set the rules of the game. And one of the key points that Kristen is making and showing very convincingly is that China is refusing to be a rule taker. But she doesn't necessarily argues that China has therefore also become a rule maker. And I think that's an important distinction and an important discussion. But what I was wondering while reading the book is why is China not becoming a rule maker? Why hasn't it become a rule maker? And I thought one way to think about this is to look at the conditions for hegemony or leadership that are typically mentioned in the academic literature. So it's often argued that hegemonic power or leadership is about, first of all, the capacity to lead. So that's number one, the willingness to lead, and finally being accepted as a leader by the other countries in the international system. So I was wondering if Kristen could perhaps reflect on that question of China's lack of rulemaking in relation to those three conditions for leadership or hegemony. So that's my first question. So the second question or issue that I would like to address has to do with an alternative explanation perhaps for the loss of US institutional power. So Kristen focuses on the fact that US weakened position in the global trading system has to do with China's rise and its refusal to play by the American rules. So she focuses very much on an external reason for US loss of institutional power. And I know Kristen has actually worked on this as well, and that has to do with a kind of an alternative explanation could be that there's also an internal reason for the loss of US institutional power, and that is the unwillingness of the US, or the increasing unwillingness of the US to itself take up a leadership role in the WTO and other institutional multilateral institutions, in part because of domestic political pressure. So Amitav Acharya recently said that Trump's victory, but also other developments such as Brexit, suggest that the current challenge to the liberal economic order is as much, if not more, from within as from without. So I would argue and agree with him that this indeed is the case, but that this also predates Trump, and in fact goes into two directions, I would argue. So some in the US, some societal interest, have demanded a more protectionist, less globalist stance of the US in the global trading system, and more generally, of course, in the multilateral institutions. And that was very much, of course, the platform that Trump ran his campaign on and has been successful on and still is, in some ways, an important political force in the US. But there has also been a decline in support by US firms and other US exporting industries and other firms to open up new markets through the WTO for quite a long time. Of course, when it became clear that WTO negotiations were not going anywhere, they have basically been pushing the US government, as well as governments elsewhere, to look for other ways to liberalize trade. So that's my second question. Do you think that these internal reasons play a role as well in US loss of leadership? So go back to what I said about the conditions for hegemony. Is the US perhaps less willing now to take on a leadership role than it used to be? And then following up from that is my final question, and that has to do with preferential trade agreements and regionalism. So you're focused on the World Trade Organization and the OECD in your book, and I think these are very interesting cases. But it could be argued that preferential trade agreements and economic regional integration efforts are actually where most of the action currently is, and where new rules are actually being set. So when looking at preferential trade agreements, economic regionalism more broadly, it could be argued that the power dynamics that you describe in the books in your book are perhaps slightly different in those bilateral regional dynamics. So just to mention a few examples, China has been very active in signing preferential trade agreements, and has overall been following the rules of the game. It has, of course, in some sense, gone perhaps less far than Western countries have in their preferential trade agreements, but nevertheless has followed the rules of the game. And second of all, the US was exceptionally active, of course, until Trump's election in signing such agreements. So, and it was certainly still setting the rules until 4 years ago. If you look at the agreement that they had signed or almost signed with the EU, as well as the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Of course, it's unclear what will happen next, and whether Biden will somehow reverse some of the policies of Trump. But I think if it does decide to rejoin the now CPTPP or the agreement with the EU, it will be on different terms, and if it doesn't, I would argue it's mainly because of domestic reasons rather than China's rise. And a final point there to conclude is that in relation to regionalism and trade, you argue that the EU has been relegated to the status of a peripheral power. You say it's now, in trade policy and governance is all about the EU and US and China. But if you look at preferential trade agreements and regionalism, you could argue that the EU is still very much a leading power. It's been very actively negotiating preferential trade agreements, and there's quite a bit of evidence that it's also influencing the design of such agreements in other parts of the world. So I was wondering if you can reflect a bit on how your conclusions would also apply to that part of trade governance and regulation. But that's where I stop, and congratulations again to Kristen for writing such an incredible book. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jappe, for these comments and for these points of discussion. We'll pass right over to Kristen to respond. And I'd like to remind the audience that you can send questions to me through the chat box starting now.
Great. Jappe, thank you for these fantastic comments and questions. There's a lot to mull over and discuss and debate here. These are fantastic. I'll start with the first point you raised, which is regarding China's global leadership ambitions. And, if China's not playing a leadership role in trying to set the rules of global trade through multilateral institutions like the WTO, why not? And I would say certainly at the WTO, China has been a rule taker. It hasn't stepped into the role of being a rule maker. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. I think China lacks a capacity to exercise leadership in the same way that the US has been exercising leadership, or even to a lesser degree, the EU and others have been able to exercise greater leadership at the WTO. And that's for a number of reasons. One, so since the rise of Trump and the U.S. assault on the global trading system, China certainly, there was a moment where China attempted to present itself as a potential alternative emerging leader of the global trading order, as a champion of free trade and multilateralism. And, there was speculation about whether China might try to step in and fill the gap left by the abdication of U.S. leadership and, assume the mantle of leading the multilateral trading system. And we saw this, for example, in Xi Jinping's speech in 2017 at Davos, right at the time of the Trump inauguration, where, it looked like China was going to attempt to play this role on the international stage. But, China has never lived up to that rhetoric. There's been an inability of China to actually perform leadership in that way. And a big part of the reason for that is China simply lacks legitimacy and credibility as a champion of free trade and a leader of the trading system, in part because of China's extensive protectionist policies, and also increasingly because of China's own economic coercion and weaponization of trade. But you mentioned that China has been following the rules of the game. I think that may have been true largely in the past, but recently, particularly in the past few years, I think that's shifted. We've really seen China blatantly disregarding the rules of the trading system and weaponizing trade as an instrument of economic coercion against weaker states. Here in Canada, we experienced that firsthand, where in retaliation for Canada's participation in the Huawei extradition case, Canada retaliated against Canada by imprisoning 2 Canadian citizens and also blocking about $4 billion worth of Canadian exports to China. And that wasn't an isolated case. Australia has experienced something very similar recently, with China retaliating against Australia because of Australia's calls for an independent inquiry into the origins of the COVID pandemic, as well as Canberra's complaints about Chinese Communist Party interference in Australia's domestic politics. So China has imposed import curbs on an extraordinarily broad range of products from Australia, agricultural and mining products. And because China is Australia's largest trading partner and the destination for 40% of its exports, China's import curbs are really designed to inflict maximum economic pain on Australia's core export sectors. And these cases aren't unique. China's used the threat or the imposition of trade restrictions to punish over a dozen countries for various perceived offenses. So this sort of behavior is in direct violation of the rules and principles of the WTO, as well as the various preferential trade agreements that China is a party to. So I don't think we can still say that China is following the rules of the game. I think, like the US, it has increasingly been blatantly violating the rules and principles of the trading system. So that all of that, severely weakens China's leadership ambitions. Anytime China has sought to lead initiatives at the WTO, it's been met with a lot of skepticism and a lot of hesitancy from other states, I think because there's this gap between its rhetoric and the reality of a lot of its behavior on trade. So that's really undermined its leadership initiatives. And I think we saw this at the WTO with the appellate body crisis, where the US under Trump began blocking appointments to the appellate body and has continued to do so under Biden. And that's really thrown the dispute settlement mechanism into jeopardy. And it wasn't China that stepped forward with concrete initiatives to try to salvage and preserve the dispute settlement system. It was the EU with its multi-party interim appeals arrangement, backed by other countries like Canada. So, the EU, in the absence of US leadership, has been stepping up and trying to display that leadership. So this gets to your question about, the EU as a peripheral power. Certainly, in the absence of US leadership, with the US assault on the trading system, the EU has tried to step up and fill that gap and save the system. But, it was successful in creating this MPIA, which is basically intended to replace the appellate body while the appellate body is unable to function. And it's been successful in getting, a number of states to participate in the MPIA, which is significant. And this is, as I said, the only concrete initiative right now to really try to save the trading system. But it also speaks to the limitations of the EU as a major power. Ultimately, There are about 50 countries participating in the MPIA, but it is missing many of the biggest traders like Japan, India, South Korea, Russia, the UK, and others. So the EU just hasn't been able to exercise the same degree of leadership as the US has in the past in terms of really getting countries on board. And without the participation of a wider array of states, and particularly some of these key trading powers, the MPIA just can't be effective. It's not enough to save the system. So this is important for thinking about, you know, the nature of the EU's power today in the trading system and also China's. Jappe, you raised this question about, you know, the dynamics going on today with US policy. How much of this is driven by domestic factors? How much of this is a response to some of these international structural factors or power shifts that we're seeing? There's no question that the domestic political scene has changed dramatically and probably irrevocably in the US. And that's had a big impact on how the US is thinking about trade and behaving at the WTO and in other trade forums. But I think one of the issues is that many of the changes we saw in US trade policy and in its orientation towards an approach towards the multilateral trading system began long before Trump and began long before these domestic changes, this dramatic rise in anti-trade sentiment, the turn towards isolationism in the US. The US shift, its turn away from the multilateral trading system really began in the early 2000s under the George Bush Jr. administration and then continued under the Obama administration. And that was long before this sort of anti-trade sentiment arose in the US. We first saw the US turning away from the multilateral trading system after the Cancun Ministerial in 2003, which was when, you know, China, India, Brazil, these emerging powers came together as a cohesive force, mobilized these big developing country coalitions to push back against US dominance in the trading system and block the US from achieving its objectives. And that was what first spurred the US to really turn away from the WTO, to go outside the WTO, emphasize instead a strategy of competitive liberalization, pursuing bilateral and regional FTAs, partly in an effort to put greater pressure on these developing country powers at the WTO to capitulate to US demands within the institution. But that proved unsuccessful. And then, you know, we saw the acceleration of an emphasis on RTAs under Obama, pushing TPP and TTIP, and also beginning to block appellate body reappointments at that stage as well. So while domestic politics are definitely playing a major role now in driving US trade policy, I think we can't ignore the role of these structural factors and this, you know, the decline in the US's institutional power. This preceded the domestic level changes and are really what first caused the US to turn away from the multilateral trading system. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it there. And thank you again, Jappe, for these fantastic questions. I think we could discuss these a lot more. There's lots to debate here, but thank you very much for these questions. And yeah, I look forward to any other questions there as well.
Thank you very much. We have received a few questions from the audience, so we'll start maybe with round of 3, and then we'll see if we have time for more in the 10 minutes that we have left here. So our first question is coming from Stephanie Spiedel, who's asking how the trade war between the US and China has affected the agricultural industry and what steps, if any, have been taken to resolve the issue. And this is related to another's question, who is wondering how you see the trade war evolving between China and the US, how you see it looking in the future. Are there any signs of change? A second question is asking about the potential of comprehensive trade agreements such as CETA and TRIPS, which also set various other types of rules and policy on sustainable development, human rights, and so on, between actors sharing common values, being able to create a viable global economic and legal environment. Why did the EU and the USA not act as partners in this regard and get China involved? And then we have another question about the other rules of the game that you mentioned. So you said that China and the US are disagreeing on many different rules of the game, so to speak. So outside of the export credit rules, what are some of the others and maybe some of the cases that you talk about in your book? And finally, I'll just, this last one here, and then we'll turn to you. You mentioned the negative effect of Chinese policies on developing countries, and can we return to this point a little bit? What have been some of the biggest effects on these countries? Have there been any positive effects? For instance, do Chinese export credit policies enable more Chinese capital development projects in developing countries? So that we'll start with those questions.
Great, fantastic. These are excellent questions. I'll start with the first question about the impact of the US-China trade war on agriculture industry. The US agriculture industry in particular has been hugely affected by the US-China trade war. When the US imposed tariffs on China, initiating the trade war, one of the first things that China did was retaliate by imposing its own tariffs. And China, like most countries, was very smart and strategic in selecting which goods from the US to impose tariffs on in order to carefully target its tariffs for maximum political effect. And so it really targeted US agriculture exports, which were hit very heavily by Chinese tariffs. And that hurt the US industry a lot. And so the US, of course, responded by providing massive volumes of subsidies to its farmers to try to offset the costs and the harm caused by China's retaliatory tariffs. So the US ag industry has really been caught in the middle of the US-China trade war in a big way. And also, with the phase 1 agreement between the US and China, one of the big things that the US pushed for was for China to increase its agricultural imports from the US. And so that's also been part of the story. In terms of where we see the US-China trade war going in future, so far it doesn't look good. I mean, there was a lot of hope when Biden was elected that we might see a real shift in US trade policy, a repudiation of Trump's policies, the US coming back into line with international trade rules. The US is, in blatant violation of the rules and principles of the WTO with its US-China trade war, but also with the policies that the US has taken directed at a large number of other states. So there was a hope that we might see a shift. But I think those hopes have been largely disappointed. Biden has continued most of Trump's trade policies, including he's maintained most of Trump's tariffs. He's continued the US-China trade war. He's continued blocking appointments to the WTO appellate body. And he's even threatening to escalate the US-China trade war in particular by threatening, there's been talk of the US initiating a new Section 301 investigation, which was the justification under US domestic trade law for the tariffs that it imposed on China under Trump. So it's now talking about potentially raising new tariffs on goods from China in order to gain greater leverage in negotiations with China to try to push for the types of structural reforms in the Chinese economy that the US is seeking. So at the moment, the situation is looking fairly pessimistic in terms of US-China trade relations. There were other questions about the other rules of the game and what other areas do the US and China disagree on, as well as questions about the negative impacts of China's trade policies for other developing countries. And these are somewhat connected. So if we look at the WTO, disagreement between the US and China was a big cause of the breakdown of the Doha round. Ultimately, towards the later stages of the Doha round, the US became increasingly dissatisfied with the prospective agreement on the table, which included large SDT, special and differential treatment, carve-outs for developing countries that would benefit China and other large emerging economies like India and Brazil. But it was really the idea of extending extensive special treatment to China, granting basically all kinds of exceptions and exemptions that would allow China to limit the degree of market opening and liberalization in its economy. That had become unacceptable, untenable to the US by 2008, 2011. And so the US pushed very hard for additional concessions from China, for China to agree to limit its SDT effectively, to participate in sectoral agreements in manufactured goods, to deepen liberalization in a number of areas, to agree not to take certain exemptions in agriculture, which would have hurt US exports. So the US really tried to strong-arm China into relinquishing its access to SDT, but China stood firm, prevented that. And so it was that conflict between the US and China that ultimately caused the collapse of the Doha round. And more recently, since the Doha collapse, there have been efforts of the WTO to negotiate standalone agreements, specifically on agriculture and on fishery subsidies, both of which are crucial issues for the developing world. Most developing countries depend heavily on agriculture and/or on fisheries for exports, as well as for food security and for the livelihoods of their populations. So there's been a big push to try to negotiate an agreement to reduce global agriculture subsidies. Here, in the past, the US, the EU, Japan, other rich countries used to be the bad guys, the biggest providers of agricultural subsidies, but that's changed dramatically. China is now the world's biggest subsidizer of agriculture. So in a shift, the US actually became a demander, pushing for reductions in agriculture subsidies, and it was willing to make significant cuts to its own agriculture subsidies, but China refused to accept any cuts or disciplines on its agriculture subsidies. So those negotiations on agriculture reached an impasse. And here, the US has an interest in opening China's market to its ag exports, but also the heavy subsidies that China provides to its agriculture sector, as well as heavy tariff protections in certain commodities, have very harmful effects for developing countries who, have a keen interest in agricultural exports. If we look at cotton, for example, China is now the world's biggest subsidizer of cotton. It's refused to accept any disciplines or reduce its cotton subsidies, and ultimately its subsidies are hurting, the poor developing country cotton producers more than anyone. Similarly, on fisheries, there's been efforts to try to negotiate a fishery subsidies agreement at the WTO. They're pushing to try to do that at the end of this month at the WTO ministerial. And fishery subsidies both contribute to the depletion of global fish stocks, which is obviously environmentally harmful, but that's also extremely harmful for many developing countries who rely so heavily on fisheries for food security and for employment. The issue there is that, again, it used to be the bad guys were, the EU, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. Now China has emerged as the world's biggest subsidizer of fisheries. And here again, China has been extremely resistant to accepting any disciplines on its fishery subsidies. So in many areas, China's subsidies are proving very harmful to developing countries, but also it's been pretty intransigent at the WTO in terms of resisting disciplines and new rules that would be very beneficial to global development and to the global environment.
Thank you so much. I would love to be able to carry this conversation on further, but we are out of time. But I would really like to thank both of our guests, Kristen and Jappe, for joining us today, as well as all of the audience members for joining in and taking part in the Q&A. Before leaving you, I would like to remind you that the Globe webinar series will continue next month on the 9th of December with Robert Faulkner on his new book, Environmentalism in Global International Society. And so, as always, you can register for that webinar at globe-project.eu, and you can also see the rest of our winter lineup. We have webinars scheduled through February, and also watch any previous episodes of the series. So thank you so much again for joining us today, and big thank you to Kristen and Jappe. And from all of us at the Globe Project, thank you and goodbye.